The bell above the antique shop door jingled softly, but the sound was drowned out by the roaring in my ears. I stood frozen behind a display of dusty porcelain dolls, clutching my purse so tightly my arthritic knuckles throbbed. I am Eleanor, 68 years old, a widow of 10 years. Until this very moment, I was a fiercely proud mother-in-law. But the woman standing at the jeweler's glass counter, her back to me, was my son's wife, Chloe. Spread across the black velvet appraisal mat were my grandmother's Victorian sapphire and diamond brooches, pieces I kept securely locked away. Pieces I had explicitly told Chloe would one day belong to her future daughter. The jeweler, a stooped man with a magnifying loupe, muttered something about the exceptional clarity of the stones. Chloe leaned heavily over the counter. She didn't ask about their rich history or how to preserve the delicate gold filigree. Instead, she lowered her voice to a harsh, desperate whisper. "I don't care about the history," she hissed, her words slicing through the quiet shop. "Just tell me how quickly you can swap the main stones for lab-created fakes without my husband noticing." A heavy dread settled in the pit of my stomach. My blood practically turned to ice. My grandmother's legacy, reduced to a counterfeit scheme. My mind raced, stumbling over the events of the past few weeks. The sudden interest she had taken in my estate, the way she had lingered in my bedroom during our Sunday dinners. I realized with a sickening jolt that this wasn't an impulsive act. This was a meticulously calculated betrayal. And, as the jeweler slowly nodded, reaching beneath the counter, I realized this wasn't her first time here. The memory of her whisper pulled me back to a seemingly innocent Sunday dinner 2 months ago. My son David was in the backyard grilling salmon, leaving Chloe and me alone in the sunroom. Usually she scrolled on her phone while I knitted, the silence between us comfortable enough. But that afternoon, she had put her device away. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the modest pearl ring I always wore. "Eleanor," she had begun, her voice dripping with an unfamiliar sugary curiosity. "David mentioned your grandmother left you quite a collection. Where do you even keep pieces like that?" At the time, I thought she was finally trying to bond. I smiled, touched by her sudden interest in our family's history, and told her about the heavy cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I even described the intricate brass locking mechanism, a detail I now deeply regret sharing. But the questions hadn't stopped there. Over the next few weeks, she didn't ask about the people who wore the jewelry. She asked about the carats, the clarity, whether the settings were platinum or white gold. She even casually inquired if I had updated my homeowner's insurance policy recently, citing a break in a few towns over. I had brushed off the slight chill her questions gave me, attributing it to the pragmatic nature of her generation. I wanted so badly to see the best in the woman my son loved. But standing in that dusty antique shop, watching the jeweler reach for his velvet trays, those innocent conversations twisted into something sinister. She hadn't been making conversation. She had been taking an inventory. And I, like a trusting fool, had given her the exact map to my most prized possessions. It wasn't until 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner that my unease solidified into outright suspicion. I was preparing for an evening gala at the Historical Society, intending to wear the very sapphire brooches Chloe was now bargaining over with the jeweler. To access the cedar chest, I needed its brass key. For 40 years, that key had rested in the exact same spot, hidden beneath the velvet lining of a musical powder box on my dressing table. My husband, bless his cautious heart, had insisted on this specific hiding place, and I had never deviated from the routine. I lifted the porcelain lid, the familiar tinkling of a Strauss waltz filling the quiet bedroom. I carefully peeled back the worn velvet. Nothing. My fingers scrambled against the bare porcelain, my pulse suddenly quickening. I emptied the box entirely, checking the floor, the surrounding drawers, even kneeling to sweep my hands under the heavy oak legs of the vanity table. The key had simply vanished. Panic is a strange thing at my age. It doesn't manifest as a scream, but as a cold, heavy stone dropping into your stomach. I sat on the edge of my mattress, trying to trace back who had been in my private sanctuary. My housekeeper hadn't been in for a week, and David never ventured past the kitchen when he visited. Then, a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. During our last family lunch, Chloe had spilled a glass of iced tea on her blouse. She had rushed upstairs to my ensuite bathroom to rinse the stain, insisting I stay downstairs to entertain my son. She was up there for nearly 20 minutes. I looked from the empty powder box to the sturdy cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I didn't need the brass key to know someone had already been inside. The missing key gnawed at me for days, a quiet suspicion I couldn't voice without proof. That proof came the following weekend, when David and Chloe stayed overnight at my house after a late evening celebrating David's promotion. Around 2 in the morning, a persistent ache in my knee woke me. I slipped out of bed, intending to fetch a glass of water and an ibuprofen from the kitchen. As I padded down the darkened hallway, the hardwood floorboards cold beneath my slippers, I noticed a sliver of light spilling from the guest bedroom. The door stood slightly ajar. David is a notoriously heavy sleeper, but it wasn't his voice I heard. It was Chloe's, hushed and frantic, hissed into a cell phone. "I told you, I just need a little more time," she was saying, her tone stripped of its usual polished sweetness. The deadline wasn't supposed to be until the 30th. "You can't just change it now." A sharp pause followed. The house was so still I could almost hear the faint, metallic buzz of the angry voice on the other end of the line. "Listen to me," Chloe pleaded, her words tumbling out rapidly, trembling with a raw panic that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. "I have the collateral. It's antique, completely untraceable, and it's a foolproof payout. Just give me until next week to finalize the swap." The swap. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, the shadows swallowing me whole as my chest seized tight. She wasn't just dealing with normal credit card debt. She was in deep, desperate trouble with someone dangerous. And as I crept silently back to my empty bed, my heart pounding violently against my ribs, I finally understood the terrifying truth of her plan. The morning after that chilling phone call, David and Chloe left for a brunch date in the city. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, I went straight to Arthur's old study. My late husband was a man of contingencies. Taped beneath the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk was a secondary brass key to the cedar chest. I climbed the stairs as fast as my aching knees would allow and knelt at the foot of my bed. The lock turned with a heavy, satisfying clack. The familiar scent of aged wood and lavender sachets drifted up, a smell that used to bring me deep comfort. Now it only made me nauseous. My hands trembled as I bypassed the silver sets and reached for the flat, midnight blue velvet box that housed the Montgomery emeralds. I held my breath and popped the clasp. At first glance, it was breathtaking. The deep green stones glittered against the satin lining exactly as they always had. But as I lifted the heavy necklace, the illusion shattered. Real emeralds, especially stones of that age and size, are perpetually cold to the touch. This metal, this glass, it was tepid. Room temperature. I carried it to the window, letting the harsh morning sunlight hit the centerpiece. The intricate web of natural inclusions, the jardin that Arthur used to say gave the stone its soul, was completely gone. It was flawlessly clear. It was synthetic. Chloe hadn't just planned the swap she spoke of on the phone. She had already begun executing it right under my nose. I stared at the cheap green glass resting in my trembling palm, a terrifying question taking root in my mind. If this was the fake, what else had she already taken? The following Tuesday, David called to ask if I could feed their tabby cat while they stayed late in the city for a corporate dinner. I agreed, playing the sweet, oblivious mother-in-law to perfection. I let myself into their pristine, minimalist townhouse just after noon. The cat was fed in minutes. The rest of my time was spent slowly slipping into Chloe's home office. I felt a sharp twinge of guilt crossing the threshold, a betrayal of my own moral code. But the cold weight of that fake emerald still haunted my fingertips. I needed absolute proof. Her desk was impeccably organized, entirely devoid of the clutter that usually comes with a lived-in space. I bypassed the locked filing cabinet and focused on the decorative woven baskets lining the bottom of her bookshelves. In the third basket, hidden beneath a heavy stack of architectural magazines, I found a sleek leather folio. My arthritic hands shook slightly as I unzipped it. Inside was a neatly stapled stack of invoices from a specialty manufacturer overseas. I scanned the itemized list, the technical jargon jumping off the crisp paper. Custom synthetic barrel cut, 14K gold-plated brass settings, lab-grown corundum. They were receipts for high-end costume replicas. But what made the breath catch in my throat wasn't just the definitive proof of her guilt. It was the meticulous notes scrawled in the margins in Chloe's elegant handwriting. I flipped through the pages, my horror mounting with every turn. There were exact measurements and covert photographs of my sapphire cocktail rings, my diamond tennis bracelet, and Arthur's vintage gold Rolex. She had ordered duplicates for nearly half of my estate, and according to the shipping dates stamped in red ink, the replicas had all been delivered to this house 3 days ago. Sunday arrived with its usual predictability, the comforting scent of rosemary roasted chicken filling the dining room, David warmly recounting his week, and Chloe sitting gracefully opposite me. But this time, I wasn't just a passive doting hostess. Before they arrived, I had opened the cedar chest and slid my grandmother's heavy cushion-cut sapphire ring onto my right hand. It was the exact piece I'd seen meticulously photographed in her hidden folio. I reached across the table to pass the bowl of roasted vegetables. The chandelier caught the deep, mesmerizing blue of the stone. It flashed with a sharp brilliance that no lab-grown glass could ever truly mimic. Chloe reached to take the dish, and her gaze snagged on my hand. She froze. It was a microscopic pause, a sudden glitch in her perfectly curated composure, but I didn't miss it. The blood drained rapidly from her face, leaving her normally flushed cheeks a sickly, ashen gray. Her hand trembled, and the heavy silver serving spoon clattered loudly against the porcelain bowl. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" David asked, pausing with his wine glass halfway to his mouth, completely oblivious to the silent war waging across his table. Chloe swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically from the sapphire on my finger to my placid expression. She forced a stiff, unnatural smile that didn't reach her eyes. Fine, it just slipped. She spent the rest of the meal chewing on silence. She had undoubtedly planned to sneak upstairs tonight and make the swap, but anchored safely to my finger, the ring was untouchable. Claiming a sudden, blinding migraine right after dessert, she practically dragged a confused David out the door. I watched their headlights sweep across the dark lawn, knowing panic always makes people reckless. Monday morning brought a thick, gray overcast that matched the heavy resolve settling in my chest. I parked my unassuming beige sedan half a block from David and Chloe's townhouse long before the sun fully breached the horizon. At 7:30 sharp, the front door opened. Chloe didn't look like the polished executive my son adored. She wore dark sunglasses, a pulled-up trench coat, and carried her oversized leather tote tightly against her ribs, her knuckles stark white against the dark material. She practically sprinted to her car. Following her was surprisingly easy. Her driving was as erratic as her nerves must have been. She bypassed the highway ramp that led to her downtown office, plunging instead into the city's industrial district, a decaying stretch of brick warehouses and chain-link fences, where the streetlights had long burned out. She finally yanked her car into a metered spot outside a narrow, grime-streaked storefront. The flickering neon sign in the window promised cash for gold and estate jewelry. It was a place where no questions were asked, and history was melted down for scrap. My stomach violently turned as I watched her push through the heavy iron-barred door, the bell inside ringing faintly. That tote bag held my grandmother's legacy. It held the real Montgomery emeralds, the very pieces she was about to sacrifice to save her own skin from whatever debt she had drowned herself in. I sat in my idling car, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my joints ached, knowing that if I let her walk out of there with cash, the proof of her theft and my family's heritage would be gone forever. I turned off the ignition, the sudden silence of the car deafening as I reached for the door handle. The bell above the heavy iron door clanged aggressively as I pushed my way inside, the sound sharp against the quiet hum of a dusty box fan. The shop smelled of stale cigarettes and tarnished brass. At the far end of a scuffed glass counter, Chloe stood rigid, her back to me. She was completely absorbed in pulling a familiar midnight blue velvet box from her tote. Behind the thick plexiglass partition, a burly man with a jeweler's loop already screwed into his eye waited expectantly. "I need 75,000 for these." Chloe's voice trembled, lacking all its usual polished authority. "Cash today." Before the man could reach for the box, I stepped up right beside her. "Those," I said, my voice dangerously calm and echoing off the grimy linoleum floors, "are not yours to sell?" Chloe gasped a raw, ugly sound and spun around. Her dark sunglasses slipped down her nose, revealing eyes wide with absolute unadulterated terror. The leather tote slipped from her shoulder, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The pawnbroker took one look at my face, then at Chloe's trembling hands, and wisely took a step back from the counter. "I don't want any domestic trouble, ladies," he grunted, firmly crossing his thick arms. I didn't break eye contact with my daughter-in-law as I reached out and firmly dragged the heavy velvet box across the glass toward me. Her breath came in shallow, panicked, ragged gasps. She looked like a trapped animal, glancing frantically at the barred windows behind me. "Eleanor, please," she whispered, her voice cracking as thick tears finally spilled over her lashes. "You don't understand. If I don't pay them by tomorrow, they aren't going to come after me. They're going to come after David." Her words hung in the stale, metallic air of the pawn shop. "They're going to come after David." My heart stuttered, a cold fury instantly replacing the shock. I grabbed her by the arm, my arthritic fingers biting into her expensive trench coat, and dragged her out the heavy iron door and onto the deserted sidewalk. The morning smog felt thick in my lungs. "Start talking," I demanded, my voice a low, dangerous hum. "And if you lie to me, even once, I will call the police myself." Between hysterical sobs, the ugly truth poured out: an offshore investment scheme, a gambling debt masquerading as a startup venture. She had borrowed heavily from loan sharks to cover her tracks before my son could discover she had bankrupted their joint savings. I just needed the emeralds, she choked out, mascara running down her pale cheeks. I was going to pay them off, and David would never have to know. I looked at the weeping woman my son loved, disgusted by the pathetic, selfish nature of her crimes. She hadn't been protecting David. She had been protecting her own lifestyle. "Here is what is going to happen, Chloe," I said, my voice eerily calm as I slipped the velvet box into my purse. "I will pay off this debt today. I will wire the funds directly to these people, and your physical threat will be gone." Her head snapped up, a pathetic glimmer of hope in her red-rimmed eyes. "But in exchange," I continued, leaning in so close, she couldn't look away from my unwavering stare, "you're going to go home, pack your bags, and tell David you want a divorce. You will leave this family, and you will never tell him why. The aftermath of an earthquake is always quieter than you expect." It has been 6 months since that overcast morning in the industrial district. True to my word, I liquidated a portion of my retirement funds and paid off the $75,000 Chloe owed. And true to my ultimatum, she left David. My son was devastated, of course. For weeks, he sat at my kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee, trying to make sense of a wife who had simply packed her bags and vanished from his life overnight. He blamed himself. He analyzed every conversation, every minor argument, searching for the crack that had shattered his marriage. It took everything in my power to sit across from him and simply hold his hand, swallowing the toxic truth that rested on the tip of my tongue. I watched him grieve a woman who had been willing to sell his family's legacy and put his life in danger to save her own pride. Sometimes, I wonder if keeping this secret makes me just as deceptive as she was. I am the one hiding things now. The real emeralds, the authentic sapphires, and the heavy gold Rolex are safely locked away in a bank vault, secure for the family. David will eventually build with someone worthy of his trust. A mother's job doesn't end when her children leave the nest. Sometimes protecting them means letting them hate the universe for a while, rather than letting them discover the monsters sleeping in their own beds. I bear the weight of Chloe's betrayal, so David doesn't have to. And as I watch him slowly begin to smile again, I know I would pay that price 1,000 times over.